Hello and welcome to another video. Today is the 15th of August. Today we're going to be doing a frontline update and we're going to talk about the recent airstrikes by the Russians on Ukrainian cities. But let's begin by looking at the situation around Kupyansk, which has barely changed since the last video. There's only one minor change that has to be reported on, and that is the Russian advance, which really amounts to about 700 meters at most, and that advance is occurring to the east of Synkivka. What I'm seeing from Russian sources, and it's not just one, there's multiple that have been mentioning this, is that the Russians are now wary of attacking Synkivka head on, because really that would lead them to incur a high amount of casualties that they view as unnecessary. So instead of attacking directly from Limon Parashi, they're going to try to flank it, or what they said is bypass it from the east. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the Russians attacking through this road, which starts in Vilshana, and you can see it leads out, and it leads through the eastern flank of Synkivka. The Russians in this area are trying to envelop the town of Synkivka and also advance through this road towards Petropavlivka and some of the Kupyansk suburbs. Another thing that's important to note is that as a result of these advances by the Russians, they're now pretty close to this road junction over here. You can see this road junction, it connects Petropavlivka to Synkivka. Petropavlivka is over here, and then that road that I'll draw over here, you can see it. If you take a left, you go into Synkivka. So that's just one of the multiple different supply lines that the Ukrainians have been utilizing to reinforce the Ukrainian defenses in Synkivka. And they have been doing a lot of fighting in Synkivka for a while, so now they need to move in reinforcements, which is what they've been doing over the past week or so. And with the Russians so close to one of those road junctions, it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to use it without being struck by the Russian artillery and on a closer, smaller scale by Russian small arms fire. Despite that fact, what I have noticed, and I've talked about this a lot, I wrote a long thread about it on Twitter, is the fact that really the pace of the Russian gains in this sector has slowed down a lot over the past few days. And that's very similar to what we saw with the situation around Crimea when the Russians were advancing around there. When the Russians were attacking from Crimea and like their positions north of the Brova over here towards the town of Torske, and we were reporting on it. The Russians were able to enter the northern outskirts of Torske, but then they were pushed back, and now the front line looks a bit like this, it just stabilized. So in the end, the Russian gains over here really amounted to about, 3 kilometers, maybe a bit less. And same thing with the bridgehead across the Zherbets River. We talked about that a lot. That was a pretty significant development to the front line. It was one of Russia's most rapid advances in a while, and that was about a 7-kilometer advance. And they were eventually pushed back, the Russians, about 3 kilometers. And now the line is around here with the Russians only in full control of one town across the Zherbets River. Now, the thing to really keep in mind about these past two examples and also about the Kupyansk front is, what is the Russian intention? Is their intention a massive offensive? I don't think it is. Is their intention to shape the battlefield in a way that would be more suitable for their logistics, that would be more suitable for perhaps future attacks, not now in the summer, maybe in the winter? Perhaps is it to divert attention away from other sectors, perhaps? Because what we're seeing each time that Russia launches these attacks aimed at even conducting a localized attack, I'm not even saying an offensive, but at securing a local objective. That could be a small town, it could be a small position. Anytime that Russia congregates a certain amount of forces, it could be a very small amount, even a platoon level. Whenever they congregate these forces, it's very, very easy for the Ukrainians, and this also applies the other way, like vice versa, by the way. But it's very easy for the Ukrainians to spot those forces congregating and making it to the line of contact. And then if that's due to the reconnaissance and the fact that really all the information is now in the open. And then from there, they are able to accurately target those advancing forces with artillery. And if that's not enough, then the Ukrainians have enough depth in their forces at the moment, whether it be from reserves or it be from really other parts of the front line, to move in those units to hold the line and even conduct their own counterattacks. So that's why any offensives are difficult, and that's why I don't think that really Russia was even aiming for an offensive on Kupyansk in the first place, at least not now, because from what I'm seeing, based on the amount of forces that they put in and the amount of effort that they're putting in, it seems way more like it's a localized attack aimed at perhaps taking over Synkivka by flanking it, or by taking over smaller observation points and strongholds along the open fields that are on the heights overlooking Kupyansk. That seems like a more realistic goal for the Russians based on their actions. And that would also come into contradiction with what the Ukrainians were saying, because the Ukrainians, when the Russians launched these attacks a week ago, they were saying that it was this large offensive that was planned at reaching Kupyansk. But I'm not sure if that's the case. We're going to have to wait and see if this Russian push north of Kupyansk turns out to be something different than the Zherbets bridgehead and the attacks towards Torska. If not, then what I said would be reflective of the actual situation. But let's move on to the situation around Urozhaine, because really there's not much that occurred on the front line that is of note. But I do want to just talk about the broader situation on the battlefield besides the territorial gains. So around Urozhaine, at this point, the Ukrainians have still not fully cleared out the southern warehouses. This is not to say that there's still Russians in this area. There's probably not. We already saw videos of the Russians retreating that we talked about in the last video, and there's also a FAB-500 strike, which the Russians launched on Urozhaine. That's something that they probably wouldn't do if they still had forces in the town, just due to the high yield that is caused by a 500 kilogram payload. But either way, the Ukrainians are now clearing out those warehouses, and it does seem like the Russians are withdrawing to Zhavitny, Bazhinaya, and Staromlynivka. So what's the aftermath? What are we going to see from here? Well, the thing for the Ukrainians now is that they have this foothold over here, and I'll try to visualize it for you guys. The Ukrainians have this foothold in Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, and then the Russians, just to the west of that, they have this pretty large bulge in their in the line. You can see it over here. The Russians, they have control of these heights that are sticking out from the level front line, because if the front line was level, it would be just a straight line from Pyotny to Urozhaine. But at the moment, that's not the case. At this point in time, the Russians, they have this bulge in the line that's sticking out, and that area, these fields that I've circled, the Russians have under their control, there are these heights that are overlooking the Mokryali River Valley, and they're also overlooking generally the entire battlefield in this area, including the Ukrainian positions that are adjacent or to the north of Pyotny, in an area like this over here, in this this basically nature reserve, Khrushcheva Balka. That's the name of the nature reserve, and it's basically Ukraine's forward positions. And that's why Ukraine has not been able to capture Pyotny yet, because of the Russian positions in this height area over here. So I'll actually show you guys a tweet of mine where I explain the situation a bit better from a couple of weeks ago. So this is from a couple of weeks ago, I believe. So the front line has obviously changed now that the Ukrainians have control of Urozhaine. But regardless, the point still holds. These Russian-controlled heights that are circled in red, those need to be captured by the Ukrainians in order to allow the Ukrainians to level the front line and then gradually advance towards targets that are deeper within the Russian lines, whether it be Staromlynivka or be Remivka, which is a town over here. If they really want to advance in a way that wouldn't leave them isolated, because if they're advancing just in one direction through the Mokryali River, and I'll show the direction of that, if they just advance like this on both sides of the Mokryali River from Staromayorsk and from Urozhaine without securing their flanks, and when I say flanks, I mean this flank over here that I'm circling, without securing that height, and the Russians will be able to fire upon those forces. Maybe the Ukrainians could still advance, but it's going to be very unnecessary casualties that they're going to incur, because the Russians, they're going to have these forward positions with ATGMs and small arms fire and basically all of that, and they'll have perfect sights to see all of the Ukrainian forces and all of the Ukrainian vehicles that are all advancing through one or two main roads that are adjacent to the river, that are all located on very, very low elevation. And also, the capture of these Russian-controlled heights would make it easier for the Ukrainians to end up taking Pyotny. So all in all, it would be better for their situation in the region. So we'll have to see how the Ukrainians respond to this threat. But that's really it for Urozhaine specifically. But just to circle back to the situation with the FAB-500, we haven't really seen the Russians use these FAB-500s that much recently. So this is pretty interesting. Just to give some context, if you aren't aware, the FAB-500, that's an old Soviet unguided bomb. And really since April, you could say, the Russians have been adding a kit with movable fins and a pop-out wing, or two pop-out wings. And in addition, the FAB-500, which was previously unguided, it now has the satellite guidance system, which does these mid-flight trajectory adjustments. So these kits, although they are pretty complex, they do cost way, way less than any sort of cruise missile, like a Caliber or anything of that sort. And the thing is, this FAB-500 with this kit, this guidance kit, it has a very, very similar payload to those extremely expensive cruise missiles, like the Caliber. Like the payload of a FAB-500 is about 500 kilograms or 1,100 pounds, something like that. And that is very, very similar to a Caliber, which is launched from sea. And these FAB-500s, they're usually dropped from Su-34s, Su-35s. And as I said before, widely used in April. But since then, really, I've been following the war for a while, and I could say I wasn't hearing that much about the Russians utilizing it. Really, the only area that it was regularly used on was around the Kherson bridgeheads in this area over here. Like on the Antonovsky Bridge, for instance, there was the use of the FAB-500, and that was really about it. I didn't really hear anything about the FAB-500 being used on Donbass, for instance. But now we have 3 different incidents of FAB-500s being used in the past few days. We said Urozhaine already. There was a video posted by the Russians where they were dropping 2 on Novodanilivka, which is interesting because Novodanilivka is one of these towns that is on the Orkhiv suburb crescent. That's what I call it. And it is a very important town that's used to supply the forward Ukrainian positions that are continuing to attack Robotyne. So it does have a significance for the front line. And then, of course, we also heard of continued Russian FAB-500 strikes on Ukrainian concentrations across the Kherson bridgehead under Antonovsky, perhaps on the Antonovsky bridgehead, but also around Kosachi-Lahari. And before we end the video, let's mention the airstrikes that were launched by the Russians on the night of August 14th and the early morning of August 15th. So what we saw was last night there were about 16 295M and 1 160M strategic bombers that were airborne above Western Russia, because that's where all their air bases are located. And once they get launched from their air bases, they usually go to what's called a launch zone, which is above the Caspian Sea. That's usually where they launch the missiles from. And from there were these explosions reported, and this is nothing new. I'm just mentioning it now because there's not much else to talk about in the video. For instance, on the 13th of August, there were also very similar airstrikes, and those caused significant damage to high-rise buildings and industrial facilities in Odessa. But anyway, yesterday and also today in the early morning, there were these reported strikes on Kramatorsk. So I'll zoom in on the towns as well so you can see for yourself. Kramatorsk, Dnipro, 3rd largest city in Ukraine, I believe. You have Khmelnytsky, another city over here. You have also Lviv, Lutsk, Ivano-Frankivsk. And the thing about Ivano-Frankivsk, which is pretty interesting, is that the reason why it was probably struck in that area is because there's a significant airfield that the Ukrainians have been using and the Russians have been striking over the past few days. And so it seems pretty likely that the Russians struck it again last night. Here it is. This is called Kolomia Airfield, and it was previously hit on August 11th. And I tried looking through the history of the airfield, and before that point, before August 11th, it hadn't really been hit at all, really, since the beginning of the war. So that's pretty interesting. And in terms of how many were intercepted, the Ukrainian Air Force, and they always post these infographics, and again, obviously take whatever they say with a grain of salt, but what they say all the time, and what they said today, is that a majority of them were intercepted. They said that out of the 28 cruise missiles that were launched last night, only 16 Kh-101/555 cruise missiles were shot down. So that would be 16. So you had 12 cruise missiles that were able to hit their target, and that included 4 Kh-22 anti-ship missiles, 4 Kh-101/555 cruise missiles, and 4 Caliber cruise missiles, which again, those are not launched from they're not launched from air above the launch zones in the Caspian Sea. Those are launched by the Black Sea Fleet from actual vessels. And so that would leave 12 that actually hit their target. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.